Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this Good Ideas webinar series focused on measuring academic performance in the wake of COVID-19. I am Veronica Garcia, Good Reason Houston's Director of Policy. Good Reason Houston exists to accelerate public school improvement access across Houston. We believe that every child in every neighborhood deserves access to a world-class public education. Today, we're diving in deep to talk about the educational impact of COVID-19 and the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead. We are excited to discuss the current situation with our guest, Secretary Margaret Spellings. Secretary Spellings' background includes she was a former senior advisor to then Governor George W. Bush. She was also the U.S. Secretary of Education under his presidency from 2005 to 2009. She's also been a university system president and is now CEO and president of Texas 2036. Her experience in leadership and education runs very deep. Welcome, Secretary Spellings, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you for all the terrific work that you do in Houston, my hometown, Sharpstown Senior High School graduate, but really appreciate all the good work that you do. It's terrific.
So let me kick us off. Why don't you tell us a little bit, what is Texas 2036?
Texas 2036, our remit, our goal is to put sensible people together to think long-term about the most important issues using tons of data. 2036, for those who are seasoned in Texas history, is our bicentennial, our 200th birthday. And we say the most important things, that means education and workforce, health, infrastructure, natural resources, issues like that. And when I say lots of data, I mean hundreds of publicly available data sets that really allow us to have a fact-based conversation about the needs of our state, the changing nature of our state, the challenges of our state, and so that we can get about the business of solving those issues and problems so we can remain a great place to live and work.
Well, thank you for all the work that you've done through all of your experience, as well as that you continue to do at Texas 2036. When you mentioned that you all are looking at, right, the long-term impact, I'll bring us to the current day and what is going on right now related to the global pandemic and essentially the direct impact that it's having today on students and their education. I think it's been about a year now, right, that it's been impacting our students. What do we know right now about what that impact looks like on our kids?
Well, we know it's been really traumatic for them in a mental health sense. I read this week that students are 10 times more likely to commit suicide in this pandemic year than previously. Not surprisingly, they're disconnected from their peers, from adults that work with them and love them, like teachers and others. Certainly from a learning perspective, it has been very discouraging, especially for our low income and disadvantaged students above all, where we've lacked broadband access, where we've lacked the necessary technology supports and other supports. So it has been a real setback for our students. But we know what to do to get them help and to remediate and to course correct and to make sure that the consequences of COVID do not pay long-term consequences for them and for all of us.
So as you know, as you mentioned that we know what to do, I would think one of the first things to even start having that conversation is measuring, right? Where are kids at?
Absolutely.
And so when I think of the topic broadly, what would you say, just what is the goal of measuring, one, student academic outcomes, and then secondly, school performance, just kind of high level?
Well, as I like to say, we need to care enough to find out, before things like annual assessment, No Child Left Behind, policies like that, we've tried it for many decades, and we knew that the outcomes were very poor especially for our disadvantaged students. So when we measure, when we test, when we care enough to find out, we can remediate, we can resource, we can make sure that we're targeting our interventions and our financial supports where we have the most chronic issues. So at an individual level, it's essential to help kids get on track, to stay caught up. It's essential for parents to know how their students are really doing and whether they're, getting the support that they need. And from a macro level, from a policy level, it allows us to make judgments about our systems, our governance, our leadership, and again, of course, resourcing and change. Look, we have, half of our students in Texas, perform at grade level. And when you look under the hood at the numbers for disadvantaged students, it's much worse than that in a time when most of the jobs require high levels of education. So we have this schism that if we don't pull up and address these needs specifically, individually, and from a system level, we're going nowhere fast.
Mhm. Now, we know that the state this year and last year made some accommodations as it relates to student assessments, testing, and accountability. What were these accommodations and was it the right decision?
I think we all recognize that this last school year was like no other, and that it wasn't appropriate given the number of students who were out of school, the inability to keep students safe, congregated, et cetera, that we should hit pause on school accountability overall in our the way we normally think of it, which is not to say that we shouldn't hold schools accountable for going and finding students, and where we're down very significant, about 250,000 fewer students showed up this fall than enrolled last fall. And so let's go find those. What are the things that schools can be accountable for this year in these strange circumstances? But yes, it was right and proper to pause the school ratings. But I, again, continue to be bullish on individual low stakes assessment so that we can find out where students are, get them the help they need, get resources targeted to the problems, and get these problems corrected, remediated so that they don't suffer long-term consequences.
How should we think about measuring student outcomes in this era of COVID-19? What is appropriate? How do we do it?
Well, I think all efforts should be made, and I know Commissioner Morath certainly is doing that, to give the STAR test in person as usual. We know that parents, some parents, and certainly those students who've been learning virtually, will elect not to participate in that way. But it will give us some significant data, and it'll be helpful. We also need to monitor things like how many AP test takers there are, and what our end of course scores look like. What do and on and on. We need as much data as we can get. I do think that we are in a pivot point that will come out of this with improved assessment and monitoring that will be more embedded in, largely technological vehicles, products, so that progress monitoring can be available to teachers and parents and students themselves in real time. We've got a ways to go before we start using that for accountability purposes. But one, silver lining from COVID is some innovations around assessment will happen.
Secretary Spellings, you mentioned progress monitoring. What is that for those of us, right, that aren't living and breathing education policy or just the world of education? What does that mean? What does that mean to the parent?
Well, sometimes I like to think of it, if you join Weight Watchers and you're trying to lose 10 pounds, you're going to go every week and they're going to weigh you and see how you did. And you're going to chart your progress along the way and course correct if you tip up, and congratulate yourself if you're going in the right direction. That ongoing similar kind of feedback is what we mean when we say progress monitoring. That's different from a test for accountability purposes that have to be standardized, comparable, valid, have some hygiene and protocols around them that are at a level different from those progress checks that happen along the way.
Will it be time to go back to normal next school year? I mean, what will normal be? What should normal be next school year?
Well, I don't think we can go back to normal, or we should go back to normal, because normal was failing a lot of students. And, our number one asset as a state is our people, our human capital. And we must do a much better job of developing our Texas student population. Our growth in Texas has largely been driven, or in no small part been driven, by in-migration from around the country and around the world, people who, for the most part, are better educated than our own native Texas population. And we have to change that if we're going to be a mighty engine of prosperity, or if our fellow citizens are going to have a prosperous life. So I hope we won't go back to normal. I hope we're going to accelerate our progress. That means more time on task. That means more days. That means research-based intervention conducted by adults who care about and are proficient with working with students in small group settings or one-on-one. That means using technology to accelerate instruction. That means getting higher levels of rigor through advanced placement or algebra 1 in more ubiquitous ways. It means stepping up our game, more time on task, resourcing the problems, and course correcting immediately.
You know, given this current moment in time, are you worried that the short term of this pandemic, which seems more than just short term since it's been about a year, are you worried that it's going to lead to a rollback of measuring school performance? And what does that mean for students? And what does it mean for our state?
I'm very worried about it. And that's why organizations like ours, Veronica, are so important. That's why we have to get the business community and the civil rights community re-engaged around these issues. Because as I like to say, when there's no problem, we don't need a solution. And when we stop testing and stop measuring and stop shining the light on where we need to resource and where our challenges are, then that's no problem. And it'll be hard for us to go to the legislature and say, please fund reading academies, please fund teachers in our most needy classrooms and pay them more. Please build out broadband in more ubiquitous ways. When there's no problem, we don't need resources, we don't need solutions. And so you bet we've got to stand tall for those things. And, it's got to be about our students. We know it's more comfortable for adults to not be have that scrutiny around accountability. And so sure, it feels comfy, but we tried it for a long time, and that's what netted out the nation at risk, the exposure of the underperformance and the under resourcing that was happening all across our country, and particularly acute in a place like Texas that's growing more diverse, that's younger. And we just have a terrific hand to play, but we've got to pay attention to the needs of every student.
You've mentioned throughout the conversation just the impact on students that are coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds and the impact of the situation on them. What do we know right now about the impact on this particular student population? And you mentioned Texas is a very diverse state. Where is our state headed unless we turn this around?
Well, we know for starters that a lot of them aren't even in school. 250,000. I mean, significant drop off in enrollment. And so, that's understandable when it's a mom or a dad in a family working multiple jobs with no access to broadband or technology. So it's just a lost year for many thousands of students, for starters. In rural communities, the inability to use online learning and to access it efficiently and effectively in ways that allow you to learn, there's another giant boulder to be overcome. We know that kids are disengaged from their friends, their colleagues, their teachers, which has taken a huge toll on all of us. Gosh. And we're seeing that. And then finally, of course, in an educational sense, our teachers are just overwhelmed with trying to meet the needs through virtual or bifurcated platforms. It's just been, nearly impossible. But we have to pull up and address these issues. But it's been a tragedy, really, for our kids and frankly for our teachers too.
As you think about, our legislature, our state legislature is in session right now. What advice, what recommendation would you have for them, when it comes to student assessment, school accountability? I expect there will be several issues that are debated within the next few months. What guidance would you provide?
Well, my organization, Texas 2036, is very much engaged in the debates in Austin and excited to be part of those conversations. For starters, we need to stand tall and support House Bill 3, the investments that were made, stay the course around those policies. Obviously, Commissioner Morath has suggested some temporary changes around school ratings and so forth. That's fine and dandy, but as soon as we can, we need to get back to regular order on those policies. That's the first thing. Secondly, we know we're going to have significant federal resources coming into our state that can be used to triage some of these learning challenges and learning problems. So extended school day, extended school year, summer school, tutoring and other interventions, more ubiquitous broadband to allow for this e-learning. I mean, we have a real opportunity to gain ground around some of the research-based strategies that we know work, especially for low-income students.
To those that would say, our students have been through enough. They've been through a year of trauma related to, this pandemic. Many now that have experienced the negative consequences of the recent winter storm. You know, are we going to make them go through a test right now? Why would we do that to our students?
Because we want to get them the help that they need. And we want to understand what help they do need. Is it math? Is it reading? Is it particular, what are we going to learn from the assessment? Yes, it's been a hard year, but that's why we're going to take the high stakes nature of it away for schools. I mean, I think this is more of an adult conversation around the anxiety about it. We just need to care enough to find out how our kids are doing so that we can get them back on track.
How would you recommend that parents engage on this issue?
One thing I've noticed, and I'm sure you probably have too, is that parents understand their students' education and learning progress or lack of often better today than they did a year ago. I mean, you'd pull that report card out of the backpack and say, okay, A minus, B plus, all good to go. But I think as a parent is working with a student, hearing him or her read, understanding and trying to help with math, I think there's a much more clear-eyed, granular view that many parents have and an engaged way with their students learning than they did before. And that, frankly, is and maybe another bit of a silver lining here.
Or a hard lesson learned.
Or a hard lesson, yeah.
Right. I know that we're really at a critical time here, and as you mentioned before, moving forward, the normal or status quo is not okay.
Right.
What transformative changes do you see coming from these hard lessons learned?
I think we need to, and it gets into a little bit of the notion about no child left behind, or challenging what my former boss used to call the soft bigotry of low expectations. I mean, we have got to get outraged about the underperformance of Texas students. And frankly, and I take no joy in this whatsoever, but to see Texas go from the mid 30s to the low 40s on our national report card in reading is a tragedy. And that's why we're glad the legislature acted on House Bill 3. But we and our policymakers let that happen. We know we can do better. We have done better. But it's going to take commitment. It's going to take resources. It's going to take accountability. It's going to take kind of a no excuses attitude about this issue. I used to say in my secretarial days, if half the school lunches served in our school cafeterias were tainted and people were getting food poisoning, we would be outraged. The fact that half the kids can't read, nobody seems to care too much. And that's our responsibility, Veronica, and organizations like yours and mine, to really light that fire and frame the consequences for our fellow citizens and for our state.
Yeah, I love that you pointed that out, Secretary Spellings, as I was about to ask. This not really just how do parents engage, and we talked about our lawmakers, but the community. How does the community rally around this issue to really lift it up and shout it from the mountaintops of the challenge?
Well, exactly. Understanding the data, getting personal with the data. How is your school doing? Who in your school is being left behind, or your community, or your school district? What are the consequences for the employer community when you have an underclass, people that are will be disconnected from the labor force and trying to engage our business leaders in this. They're not going to have successful businesses without people to work in and lead them and so forth. So I think painting that picture locally, the consequences locally, just like you all at Good Reason Houston do.
And I wanted to flesh a little bit. You gave a stat in terms of where Texas stands nationally of how we've fallen in reading. If you could tell our audience what does that actually mean practically? Reading is, are we talking about third grade reading proficiency, and what does that mean for
We're
academic?
talking about fourth grade reading as indicated and assessed on the NAEP, a national sample, not a test that's given to every student, but together constituting our national education report card. In the early 2000s, we were in the mid 30s on fourth grade reading, Texas students, and we fell to, I believe, 46th in the last administration of that test. That's for two reasons. One, our peers and competitors, states like Mississippi, of all places, sped up. They got better. They focused on reading achievement and they resourced it. They trained teachers. They had extra interventions for student and they sped ahead. Um, and we stopped paying attention to it in the ways that were fulsome enough to get those results. And so we're always in a space race with other states, but we have proven that we know how to be better than we have been of late. And I'm encouraged with the legislature's action in House Bill 3, and we have to continue to implement those policies like reading academies going forward.
And so, for those who are joining us this afternoon, House Bill 3 passed two legislative sessions ago, so 2 years ago, invested significant amount of funding into our public education, into our schools, into our students, but did so strategically with focus really on student outcomes. You've mentioned reading academies. What is that? What are those doing?
It's frankly, a strategy that we have employed when we were getting better results in reading, and it's pretty simple on its face, and that is that we need to make sure that our teachers are fully prepared and fully understand the research base around reading instruction. How do we get little readers to learn how to read? How do we help struggling readers improve? And making sure that our teachers are fully equipped with strategies to address those needs, and to making sure that every single teacher preparation program can embrace those research-based strategies and using them with fidelity in our schools, in our districts, and particular with our struggling readers. That's what a reading academy is. It also means that we're going to have to use time differently, that some students are going to need more time to become proficient, and that's okay.
Well, Secretary Spellings, as we start coming close to the end of our time here, it went by rather quickly. Is there any last comments, words that you would want to share with our audience today as it relates to, the impact of the here and now of the pandemic and measuring our students moving forward?
Well, I think I would just want people to know and understand that the actions we're taking today are going to have long-term consequences. They're either going to pay big dividends because we'll have the most educated, most highly skilled, mightiest, most diverse, largest workforce in the nation, and one of the largest in the world, and we will create a flywheel effect that will make Texas just an awesome place for a very long time. Conversely, if we fail to address these issues, to pull up, to resource, to commit, to challenge that soft bigotry of low expectations, our state, and especially these individuals, will pay consequences for a very long time. And that is a moral responsibility that we have to each other, but to ourselves and the kind of state we want to be into the future, into 2036 and beyond.
We are truly at a pivotal moment in time right now.
We really are.
Well, Secretary Spellings, thank you so much for joining us this morning, for sharing your knowledge, your expertise. I know that I've learned a lot during this brief time. And thank you to all our attendees who join our discussion today. Again, I'm Veronica Garcia. I'm hoping that you join us for our next Good Reason Ideas webinar. It will feature Chairman Harold Dutton, the chair of the Texas House Public Education Committee, on March 22nd. We will send out more details on that coming up. Thank y'all for listening and have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Thank you,
Thanks,
Secretary.
Veronica. Appreciate you.